From the 29th to the 31st of October 2019, the International Department of the University of Sao Paulo, or AUCANI, hosted the second Brazilian seminar on English as a Medium of Instruction, or BEMIS2, following a successful one-day event at the Federal University of Paraná in Curitiba last year. The event was supported by Cambridge Assessment English, Kelly Tavares, Alberto Costa, and Ana Bartolo, and we're grateful to Jennifer Uller of the Regional English Language Office of the American Embassy for sponsoring 3 of the speakers. BEMIS2 was co-organized by Professor Luciana Carvalho Fonseca, Cristina Borba, and Caroline Parra of USP, with the constant encouragement of Professor Laura Izara. As one of the co-organizers, I thought it might be useful to give a very personal summary and reflection on the 3 days of presentations and discussions. My name's John Corbett, and I'm a CAPUS International Fellow and Visiting Professor at the University of Sao Paulo. So what is BEMIS and why does it exist? The Brazilian EMI seminar, or BEMIS, was initiated by Professor Ron Martinez of the Federal University of Paraná and his colleagues in Curitiba in 2018 to debate issues around policy, stimulate research, and share good pedagogical practice in the delivery of Brazilian university courses through the medium of English, EMI. We know this is happening, and there are many reasons why it is happening, for better or for worse. BEMIS provides a forum to debate policy and issues arising from the growth of EMI, highlight successes and failures, and share the considerable challenges and show good practice. Too often we work in isolation. BEMIS gives us space to share our concerns and perhaps some solutions. The presenters at BEMIS have always been an interesting mix of content providers from public and private universities. For example, professors of dentistry, engineers, marketing, design, and they've been joined by language educators, policymakers, and graduate researchers into language and pedagogy, as well as people like commercial examination providers. Often there is a productive overlap between these roles. The language teacher might become a content provider in another discipline like marketing. The language teacher might also work with state administrators to develop a university language policy. The administrator might come to an agreement with an exam provider to involve language educators in developing the EMI skills of content providers. And a language educator might become intrigued with all of this activity and decide to do a master's degree or a PhD on the topic, and so on. But overall, the 3 foci remain the same: pedagogical practice, pedagogical research, and policy. There is, of course, a silent P, politics, and politics underlies all of the EMI ecosystem. So what happened at BEMIS2? It's impossible to capture 3 days of sophisticated presentation and sometimes intense discussion in a short summary, so I'll grab some dominant themes and report on issues that seem to me to be unresolved. I should restate that this is a personal view. It's not authorised by USP or even by my wonderful colleagues and fellow participants, so you can blame me personally for the opinions here expressed. I'll talk briefly about EMI pedagogy, research and policy in that order, before suggesting agenda items that will take us to BEMIS3 and perhaps beyond. So first of all, the practitioner stories. Probably the most compelling feature of the 2 BEMIS events so far has been the power of the EMI practitioners' accounts of what they've been doing and how they've addressed their continuing challenges. The most inspirational stories come from professors of dentistry, engineering, design, music, and so on, sharing their MI experiences and thus disseminating good practice. And so we had Camilla Tirapelli from the dental school in Ribeirão Preto telling us how a shift from formal to informal settings for EMI transformed her students' learning. After a focus on formal lectures and workshops in English was a relative failure, she and her colleagues experimented with an informal lunchtime setting which relaxed the participants, equalised the hierarchies between students and professors, and led to a greater use of English, particularly for reading, and much more enjoyment of reading for research through English. We had Fernando Ribeiro of ESPM sharing his own experiences of juggling students' aspirations and expectations in a high-intensity business program. How can we support students with variable language abilities while maintaining an intellectual challenge, making things simple, yet not simplistic? The issue of pre-testing students for EMI courses was a hot topic. There's a legitimate desire not to exclude students on the basis of language, while guiding them to choose courses that they will actually benefit from. It's a tricky balancing act. We had KARINA Fernandes of the Federal University of Paraná talking about developing the role of ETAs, English Language Teaching Assistants or monitors from Letras, in supporting content providers from other disciplines. During Karina's session, many notes were being taken, and I'm sure others will adopt her good practices in this respect. We had Ivan Sequeira from ECA in USP alerting us to the fact that arts professors can make use of online apps and creative approaches to teach logical thinking and writing across disciplines, for example by imagining the structure of an essay as a piece of music. Good multidisciplinary stuff. Clovis Alvarenga Neto of the Escola Politécnica at USP suggested that design itself was an international language, and that courses in design can attract and stimulate students who don't even share a single lingua franca. There are ways of collaborating and working together through many languages at the same time, what we've been calling translanguaging. And if they translanguage effectively and collaboratively, they can still do a program that focuses on the design process. And Rodrigo Ramirez of FATEC, and in particular the Centro Estadual de Educação Tecnológica Paulo Sousa, told the story of how he himself had crossed disciplines from language teaching back to marketing, reaching into his past to deliver a course on branding in English to students from relatively underprivileged backgrounds, thus increasing their confidence in the use of English and also their employment prospects. The stories of the content providers themselves, the disciplinary professors who are adopting English as a medium of instruction, these stories have probably been the authentic, inspirational core of each BEMIS so far. But Rodrigo's story of bringing his own language teaching skills to inform his rebirth as a teacher of marketing resonated with those sessions that reflected on appropriate methodologies for delivering EMI. 3 presenters sponsored by the American Embassy's Regional English Language Office, KERRY PUSEY, Lee Alexander, and Lucas Murphy, demonstrated the ways in which language teaching methodology is acting like a beneficial virus on higher education pedagogy more generally, with EMI as a kind of carrier. KERRY and his colleague Marcia Del Coruna showed how TESOL methods can be transferred across disciplines taught in EMI. Lee Alexander demonstrated beautifully how an explicit focus on developing students' language resources can benefit their overall learning. And Lucas Murphy reminded us that effective formative assessment is one means of boosting students' and professors' confidence in exploring content areas through English. Lucas also gave probably the most memorable and useful piece of advice to professors using EMI to deliver their courses, and that is, never apologize. The interaction between ELT methodological strategies and multidisciplinary pedagogies came up again in my colleague Luciana Carvalho Fonseca's session that recounted her and my experience of contributing to a pilot course in teaching USP professors towards the Cambridge Certificate in EMI skills. Both Luciana and I have been struck by the ways in which the online and face-to-face components of the Cambridge Assessment English course draw upon basic language teaching strategies. We recognise things like icebreakers, pair work, group work, and task-based learning. EMI again seems like a way of smuggling fundamental aspects of pedagogical training into academic environments that might have so far lacked that kind of experience for novice professors. the generous testimonials by a number of students in the course, Arturo Forner Cordero, Ricardo Ricci Uvigna, Adriana Bonamatas, Silvia Miyazaki and others, suggested that there's a need for such instruction, or even just a space where professionals can meet and talk about their challenges and their potential solutions to those challenges. The practical and political aspects of English as a medium of instruction are, of course, fertile ground for research that can inform developing pedagogies and future policy. On the pedagogical side, I was very happy to see in Sao Paulo a strong contingent from Curitiba. I'll try to stop calling them the Curitiba Mafia, who are professors, graduates and graduate students actively researching aspects of English as a medium of instruction, often under the supervision of Professor Ron Martinez. Ron's opening keynote on the second day of the seminar set the stage for the following round table. Ron asked the key question, why many professors in Brazil who do not necessarily have multinational groups of students are still choosing to deliver content in English. The reasons may be various. There might be institutional pressure, financial or promotional incentives, a desire to keep up one's own dearly acquired language skills. But, he suggested, there might be an even more powerful reason. Like other individuals and groups who decide to switch languages for at least some of the functions of their daily lives, academics might choose to use English because they aspire to belong to a perhaps idealized community, an international community of scholars. They're inspired by the idea of belonging to that community of practice. Ron Martinez's focus on identity as a driver of, or perhaps a barrier to, English as a medium of instruction was picked up by Ana Cibele Palma, Angela Hoffman Valesco, and Karina Fernandes. Angela talked about the decline in the perception of English as the domain of the mythical gringo native speaker, I am paraphrasing, and the increasing sense of multicultural ownership of English that comes from initiatives like English as a medium of instruction. Anna talked about what she described as the elephant in the room, emotion in EMI delivery. How does the professor feel about the language she or he is using? And does the professor inhabit the same emotional space as an English speaker as she or he might do as a Portuguese speaker? Karina also showed how action research into practices that impact on identity can have beneficial outputs in terms of improved EMI pedagogy. Overall, the Curitiba contingent were very, very valuable in showing us that Brazil is developing its own themes, concerns and topics in the international EMI research community, and that Brazil is no longer just becoming a consumer of EMI research, it's also becoming a producer. Which brings us to policy and politics. EMI is usually seen in the larger context of the internationalization of universities globally, normally advertised as a good thing in that students from different cultures and linguistic backgrounds can come together in a safe intellectual space and learn from international professors and each other via a lingua franca, English. In practice, this kind of aspirational vision can be challenged. USP only has 4% overseas students, and most of those are from South America, so who is EMI really benefiting in this kind of context? Alberto Costa of Cambridge Assessment English gave a clear, comprehensive, interactive workshop on what universities need to consider if they're to develop and sustain a coherent internationalization policy that embraces EMI. For those of us involved in developing, implementing, or even critiquing such policies, it was a tremendously useful session. Telma Jimenez and Eliane Segate both presented policy research sponsored by the British Council into EMI policy and practices in Brazil. Telma is an emeritus professor at the State University of Londrina, and she reported in a study of 2 university institutions. She did this research alongside Alessia Kogo of Goldsmiths, Luciana Calvo of UEM, and Michele El Cadre of UEL. They found that in Brazilian contexts, you have to rethink of English as a lingua franca, and you have to rethink the language classroom, the EMI classroom, as a translanguaging space, Portuguese and English. And if you do this, you benefit the delivery of content through English, perhaps with English in inverted commas. Eliane Segate, the Vice President of FOBI, presented a heartening case study of effective collaboration between different university institutions in Paraná, the kind of collaboration that seems miraculous to a hard-bitten cynic like myself. She also reported that the collaboration extended not only to those 7 universities, but to the British Council, the AUCANI Foundation, and the state government in Paraná. The result of all this collaboration was an initiative called Paraná Fala Inglês, which then became Paraná Fala Línguas, Paraná Speaks Languages, and it was, by all accounts, successful. But a key question raised at the end of Eliana's presentation was, yes, the project seems to have been successful, but what now? Will Paraná Fala Línguas be allocated enough continuing resources to remain effective? Last, but far from least, José Molina demonstrated with his very presence the value of internationalization. A participant from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, José brought his own experiences of developing EMI policies and practices and his own developing comparative research into EMI in Brazil and Colombia. He showed us the potential of an outsider's perspective on our own issues and made the case, perhaps, for a South American EMI association where the issues raised at BEMIS could be debated on an even broader scale. One of my abiding memories of the end of BEMIS-1 in Curitiba was the co-organizer Ron Martinez's exhaustion at the end of the day. And certainly by the end of BEMIS2, I shared that exhaustion, as did, no doubt, many of the other participants. However, one participant, Marcia del Corona of UNISINOS, has bravely, or perhaps foolishly, offered to explore the possibility of hosting BEMIS3 in Rio Grande do Sul in 2020. I know what you're thinking. I'm thinking it too. Wine. But apart from the academic tourism potential, there are certain themes that continue to bubble up over the 3 long days of BEMIS2, and though there are too many to note here, it might be worth thinking about a few more as we move forward. EMI, internationalization, and global mobility are often presented as uncomplicated forces for good. We know that this is not necessarily the case. EMI, internationalization, and even global mobility can disempower individuals as much as they can empower them. Travel can narrow the mind as much as it can broaden it. Yet these forces, the forces of EMI and internationalization and mobility, are with us, and given their influence, we have to ask how we can support them in such a way as to accentuate the positives and play down the negatives. The most commonly revisited concern over the course of the 3 days is what is the role of language assessment, benchmarking, pre-testing in an EMI delivered programme or course. We don't want to exclude students from being medical students or engineering students on the basis of low English competence. However, we recognise that it's very, very difficult to benefit from a course that is taught via English if your competence in English is relatively restricted. So how do we balance these concerns? How do we give support to those people who need more language help? This is a topic that we kept coming back to. We will keep coming back to. It hasn't been wholly resolved. An unresolved concern that really interests me is that EMI pedagogy is it's obvious from the seminar that EMI pedagogy is drawing productively from ELT and TESOL methods, and that's obviously a good thing. But can we broaden the interaction between scientific disciplines and other arts and humanities-based subjects to promote a more creative and perhaps even deeper collaboration between epistemologies as well as learning strategies? I'm thinking here of the role of English in the context of medical humanities, and we might create engineering humanities, agricultural humanities, and so on. We all, no matter our discipline, we all share ethical, social and political concerns, and these could be the basis for cross-disciplinary discussions via the medium of English. Can we extend EMI methodology beyond TESOL-inspired frameworks? Finally, and we've already really mentioned this, how can positive initiatives be funded and be funded in a prolonged and sustainable fashion? Between BEMIS1 and BEMIS2, we saw the sudden demise of Idiomas Sem Fronteiras. In BEMIS2, we heard of the success of Paraná Fala Línguas, but how certain is its future in a world of volatile political priorities and perhaps the relative ignorance of those people who decide university and language policies? BEMIS is a talking shop and a very stimulating one, but should it assume an advocacy role too? And if it doesn't, who assumes an advocacy role for EMI practitioners and theorists? Whatever happens, I look forward to revisiting and discussing these issues in more detail in the future. For now, thanks to all who came and contributed to BEMIS2, especially Luciana, Christina and Caroline, who helped organise it, Laura, who encouraged it, and Sandra, who helped with the admin. Good luck to the hosts of the next event, and thanks very much for watching.